Caleb Voss pressed the barrel of his revolver against Evelyn Hartwell's cheek hard enough to leave a mark, and the entire saloon went so quiet you could hear the candles guttering in their holders. "Tell them," he said. Not loud. He didn't need loud. "Tell every person in this room what happens when somebody thinks they're better than Caleb Voss." Evelyn's jaw was tight. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not entirely, but she didn't look away from the crowd. 30 people. 30 people who owed her something, who had eaten at her table or slept under her roof, and not one of them moved. That was the moment Elias Crowe stood up from his corner chair. He wasn't fast about it. His knees were bad and the chair scraped the floor when he rose, and a few heads turned just from the noise of an old man getting to his feet. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd come in out of the cold for a meal and maybe 2 hours of sitting somewhere that wasn't the wind. But he knew what he was looking at. He'd seen it before, and he'd walked away from it once already. He wasn't going to do that again. If this story found you, if something about a woman who refused to quit and an old man who had nothing left to lose except his conscience spoke to something in your chest, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel before we go any further, because the story of Red Hollow doesn't get simpler from here. It gets harder, and then it gets true. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your city and country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And now, let's go back to where it all began. The winter of 1892 arrived in Red Hollow, Texas. The way bad news always did, quietly and then all at once. By the time the first hard frost settled over the rooftops, 3 families had already packed their wagons and left without saying goodbye to anyone. A 4th was rumored to be going before Christmas. The hardware man on Colton Street had nailed boards over his front window, and not because of weather. The boarding house at the end of Marsh Road was one of the last places in town that still had lights on after 8 in the evening, and that was only because Evelyn Hartwell refused to go dark before 10, rain or drought, or the slow economic strangulation that Caleb Voss had been running on this town for the better part of 4 years. She was 39 years old and had the kind of face that showed you exactly what it had cost her to get there. Not ugly, not worn down in the way that breaks people, but there were lines at the corners of her eyes that weren't from laughing, and her hands were rough in the way that came from doing every job herself because she couldn't afford to hire it out. She'd built the east wall of the boarding house with her own labor the summer after her husband Martin died, because the contractor she'd hired took her deposit and disappeared down the Laredo Road. She'd figured out the framing from a library book and the advice of an old carpenter named Sweeney, who lived 3 lots down and was drunk more often than not, but honest when he wasn't. The boarding house had 6 rooms. 4 were occupied most of the time. 1 stayed empty for weather travelers, and the last one she kept for herself. A narrow room with a window that looked out over the back lot where she kept 2 chickens and a garden that had been struggling for 3 seasons now, because the irrigation ditch that ran behind Marsh Road had been quietly redirected 18 months ago. She'd complained to the county office. They'd sent a letter, then another. Nothing happened. She knew whose hand was in it. Everyone in Red Hollow knew whose hand was in everything. Caleb Voss had come to this part of Texas 11 years ago with enough money to buy 2 things, land and patience. He was not a dramatic man in the way frontier villains were supposed to be. He didn't ride through town shooting at weather vanes or drag people into the street. He wore clean clothes. He spoke in a measured voice. He had a lawyer named Pritchard who did most of the talking for him, and a pair of men named Dolan and Ferris who did the kind of work that didn't need talking at all. What Voss wanted, what he had always wanted, was the railroad. Not to ride it, to own the land beneath it. The Southern Pacific was planning a spur line through this part of the county, and whoever held the corridor got the freight contracts, the station rights, the decade of development money that followed wherever iron rails went. Voss had spent years quietly acquiring the parcels he needed. He'd bought some outright, fairly, early on when sellers didn't understand what they had. He'd used debt manipulation on others, lending money at reasonable rates, waiting for a bad season, then calling the note at exactly the wrong moment. A few properties he'd simply had condemned on technicalities that Pritchard manufactured on paper. He needed one more piece of land. He needed Evelyn Hartwell's lot on Marsh Road. She'd been offered money twice. The first time it was a fair price, and she'd said no because she'd built that place and had no intention of starting over somewhere new. The second time, Pritchard came with documents she didn't fully understand and a number that was 30% lower than the first offer. and she'd told Pritchard to get off her porch and not come back without something worth her time. That was 7 months ago. Since then, things had gotten harder in ways that were difficult to prove and impossible to ignore. Her feed supplier in Garrison had stopped filling her orders, citing a backlog that never seemed to clear. The man who repaired her roof in the spring had done a poor job. She found out later he'd been told his contract with the Voss cattle operation would end if he did quality work for anyone on Voss's list. 2 of her long-term boarders, men who'd lived in her rooms for over a year, had quietly relocated to the hotel on Voss's north side of town after visits from men they wouldn't describe to her. She was down to 4 paying guests, then 3. The month of November had come in at a $70 shortfall, which wasn't something she could absorb. She'd gone to the First Territorial Bank on the 15th to ask about extending the terms of her small operating loan. The manager, a mild man named Dunlap, who had always been professional with her, wouldn't meet her eyes when he told her the bank had recently reviewed its exposure in the Marsh Road Commercial District and would not be in a position to extend additional credit at this time. She walked out of the bank and stood on the boardwalk for a long time, just breathing. She knew what was happening. She could see the shape of it as clearly as she could see the frost on the hitching posts. She was being squeezed until she broke, and most of the people doing the squeezing were too afraid to refuse the hand that was pushing them. What she couldn't figure out was what to do about it. That evening, she made supper for her 3 remaining boarders. A dry goods drummer named Calhoun, who traveled the circuit between Red Hollow and Ferris Junction, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Peel, who had nowhere else to go, and a young carpenter's apprentice named Tuck, who was saving money with the intention of eventually getting nowhere fast. They ate together in the small dining room off the kitchen, and Evelyn listened to them talk about other things, the weather, a story Calhoun had heard about a fire in Abilene, and she kept her face arranged so they wouldn't see the numbers running behind her eyes. She cleared the dishes herself, the way she always did. She thought about her husband Martin, which she did more when things were difficult. Martin had not been a remarkable man in any way people wrote down, but he'd had a particular quality she'd never found a word for, a willingness to stay present in a bad situation when most people started looking for the exit. He'd stayed. That had been his whole thing. You told him the roof was leaking and the money was gone and the neighbor's bull had broken through the fence again, and he'd just say, "All right, let's start with the roof." She missed that. She missed having someone to start with. After the dishes, she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and went over her accounts for the 4th time that week, as if they might have changed since Tuesday. They hadn't. She was still short. The sound of the door reached her just past 9 o'clock. Not her front door, the one guests used, but the side door that opened onto the alley. Someone knocked twice, then once, which was the pattern her neighbor Alvarez used when he wanted to come around back without being seen from the street. She let him in. Ramon Alvarez ran the saddle repair shop 2 doors down and had lived in Red Hollow for 15 years. He was 53, a compact and careful man who chose his words slowly. He'd been born in Chihuahua and crossed north as a young man and had the kind of history he didn't discuss with people he didn't trust. He sat down at her kitchen table without being asked, which was the only sign of how serious this was. "Dolan was in my shop today," he said. Evelyn set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from him. "What did he want?" "He didn't say directly. He looked at my workbench, looked at my tools, asked me how business was. Told me he'd heard I was behind on my supply orders." Alvarez wrapped both hands around his cup. "I am behind, 2 weeks. It's not serious yet, but he knew the number." "They're tracking accounts," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "Somebody at Dunlap's bank is talking," Alvarez said. "Has to be. The numbers he mentioned, there's no other way he gets that information." He looked at her. "He also mentioned your name." "What did he say?" "That you were a stubborn woman and Caleb was losing patience. That sometimes when a person refuses to be reasonable, other people in their situation get caught in the inconvenience. He said it flat, the way you repeat something you don't endorse. I know what that means. I've been here long enough." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to come tell me this." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." They sat with that for a minute. "I don't know what to do," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud to anyone, and the saying of it felt different from the thinking of it. Heavier in one way, lighter in another. "I know what he's doing. I can name every piece of it. But knowing what a man is doing and being able to stop him are different things, and I don't have the money or the law or the connections to fight him on any ground he cares about. The law here is Sheriff Greer, Alvarez said. Who Voss has had in his pocket since the last election, Evelyn said. I know. Alvarez nodded slowly. There's a new man at the saloon, he said after a moment. Came in 3 days ago, old, maybe 60, traveling alone, keeps to himself. Haskell told me he paid a week in advance for his room, which he said nobody does. I don't see how that helps me. Probably doesn't, Alvarez said. He stood. I don't know, something about him. He doesn't look at things the way a man does when he's passing through. He looks like a man who stopped. He finished his coffee standing up and thanked her for it and went back out through the side door. Evelyn sat at the table alone and listened to the wind against the kitchen window and tried very hard not to think about what she was going to do when the next month came in and she was still short. She didn't come up with anything. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. Elias Crowe had stopped in Red Hollow because his horse had thrown a shoe outside Garrison, and the nearest farrier willing to work on a Tuesday afternoon was here. That was the whole of it. He'd paid for the shoe, paid for a room at the Callaway Saloon on the theory that the beds were probably better than the livery, and then discovered that his right knee, which had been stiff since early October, had gotten significantly worse during the ride, and that getting back on a horse the next morning was going to be something he'd regret by noon. So he stayed. He was 61 years old, which in 1892 in this part of Texas meant he had outlasted most of the men he'd known in his younger life. He was not sentimental about this. He'd had a career as a lawman for 14 years, then 10 years of work he described as consulting when asked and didn't describe at all when not asked, and then a long period of traveling that had started as something purposeful and gradually become something else. He had no family that he knew of. He had a sister in Missouri who he sent money to twice a year without a letter because he didn't know what he'd put in a letter. He carried a revolver out of habit, not optimism. His shooting was still good on the days his hands weren't bad, which was most days. He didn't look for fights, and he didn't go to places where fights were likely. He sat in corners when he could, had one drink a night because his stomach had started complaining about two, and went to sleep early because there was nothing to stay up for. He wasn't a sad man exactly. He'd moved past sad somewhere in his 50s. He was more like a man who had used up the part of himself that wanted things and was now just going through the geography. On his third evening in Red Hollow, he was sitting in his corner of the Callaway Saloon with a half-finished whiskey and no particular thoughts, when the door opened and Evelyn Hartwell came in. She didn't come in the way women usually entered saloons, cautious or loud, or with some specific business that needed doing fast. She came in the way a person came in when they'd been walking fast, and the door was just the next thing in front of them. She was wearing a dark coat with a fraying collar, and her hair was coming loose on one side. She went to the bar and spoke to the bartender, a tall man named Haskell, in a low voice. Elias watched this without moving his head, the way he'd learned to watch things a long time ago. Whatever she said to Haskell, he shook his head once, then twice. He looked sorry about it. She nodded and started to leave. That was when the door on the other side of the room opened. Caleb Voss came in with Dolan and Ferris, which was how he always came in, never alone, always with the specific gravity of men who knew where the exits were. He was 50-something, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had never been handsome but had learned to be authoritative instead. He wore a decent coat and clean boots, and you would have thought him a prosperous rancher, which he was, among other things. He saw Evelyn before she saw him. And something shifted in his expression, not anger exactly, not pleasure, something more like a decision being made. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, conversationally. The whole saloon heard it, but only because the room got quiet when he walked in, which it always did. "I'm glad you came in. I was going to send someone around tomorrow." Evelyn turned. Her face didn't change much, but her hands, which had been moving toward her coat buttons, went still. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I was just leaving." "No," he said. "I don't think so." It was 2 words. Just 2 words. And Elias watched the room absorb them, watched Haskell's hands go flat on the bar, watched the 2 men at the nearest table find reasons to look at their drinks. Voss walked across the room toward her, and she held her ground, which Elias noticed. Most people stepped back when Voss walked toward them. She didn't. "You've been difficult," Voss said, still conversational. I've tried to be patient. Pritchard tells me I'm too patient, honestly. I'm starting to think he's right. I haven't done anything to you, Evelyn said. I've refused to sell you my property, which is my legal right. Everything else has been what? He tilted his head. Business. I don't know what you're suggesting, Mrs. Hartwell, but the bank makes its own decisions, and so do the merchants in this town, and so does every free man in Red Hollow. He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his chin. That's the beauty of a free market. You know what you've done, she said. I know what I've done, he agreed pleasantly. The question is whether you're going to be smart about what happens next. He reached out and put a hand on her arm. She pulled back, and that was when something in him changed. That shift, that decision. And he moved faster than a man his age had any right to, getting his hand around her wrist and turning her to face the room. And when she tried to pull away, he reached into his coat, and the revolver was just there, against her cheek, just like that, with the smoothness of something he'd thought about before this moment. The saloon was 30 people in total silence. Look at them, he said, to her, quietly. All of them. Every person in this room who borrowed from me or sold to me or looked the other way when I needed them to. Every person who knows exactly what I'm capable of and has decided it's easier to keep their head down. He pressed the barrel a fraction harder against her face, and she made a sound that wasn't a word. Involuntary, something she couldn't stop. This is what happens when somebody thinks a boarding house on Marsh Road is worth more than cents. Elias set his glass down. He did it carefully, so it didn't make noise. He got to his feet. The knee protested. He ignored it. And he walked out of his corner toward the open floor. He didn't do it fast. He wasn't going to pretend his legs were 20 years younger than they were. Let her go, he said. His voice came out steady, which mildly surprised him. Voss looked at him the way you look at something unexpected, a brief recalibration, and then his expression settled back into what it usually was. Who are you? Nobody, Elias said. Let her go. The room waited. Voss laughed. It was a real laugh, too, not a performance. Genuine amusement at an old man who had apparently forgotten what century he was in. He glanced at Dolan, who was already moving. What followed was not a gunfight. It was not even a fair fight. Dolan was 35 and had done this kind of work for 8 years, and Elias's knee went completely wrong the moment Dolan's first hit caught him across the jaw. He went down on one knee, then got hit again, and went down all the way. He heard Ferris somewhere behind him, and then there were boots involved, and none of it was anything he'd have chosen. When they were done, Dolan took his revolver off him, because of course they did, and then Ferris had him by the collar, and the next thing was the cold night air and the dirt of the street outside. He lay in it for a minute. Through the saloon window he could see the lamplight and the shapes of people, and he could hear Voss's voice, back to measured, back to conversational, explaining something to the room about the nature of patience and property rights. Elias turned his face out of the dirt. His jaw was already swelling, and his ribs on the left side were telling him things he didn't want to hear, and he had no gun, and the temperature was dropping fast. He lay there and thought about another night, years back, when he'd had all the reasons in the world to walk into a different room and had found a different reason not to. He thought about the face of the woman he hadn't helped, and what had happened after he walked away, and how he'd been carrying that since. He thought, not this time. He got his hands under him. He started pushing. He was going to need his revolver back before any of this could go anywhere useful, but one thing at a time. First thing was getting upright. Second thing was figuring out what came after that. He got upright. His knee held, barely. He stood in the cold outside the Callaway Saloon in Red Hollow, Texas, and the wind was coming off the flat land to the north, and he was 61 years old and beaten up and gunless. And he stood there and breathed and waited for his vision to fully clear. He had a feeling this town wasn't done with him yet, and he wasn't done with this town. He stood in the cold for a long time before he moved, not because he was afraid. Fear had a different texture than this, and Elias knew the difference well enough by now. This was something closer to calculation. The kind of stillness that comes when a man has very few resources left and needs to be careful about the order in which he uses them. His jaw had swollen to the point where opening his mouth too wide produced a specific kind of pain that started behind his ear and ended somewhere near his left eye. His ribs were worse, not broken, he didn't think, but the kind of bruise that would make the next 3 mornings interesting. His revolver was inside the saloon, in Dolan's belt or on the bar or in a drawer somewhere, and without it, he was an old man in the dark with bad knees and no particular leverage. He turned this over. The saloon noise had gone back to something close to normal. Voices, a glass being set down, the particular murmur of people who had just witnessed something uncomfortable and were trying to talk their way back to ordinary. Voss would still be in there. He didn't leave spaces quickly. He liked to let a room settle around what he'd done, let people absorb the lesson, let the silence do the second half of the work. Elias walked around the side of the building. The alley between the Callaway and the dry goods store next to it was dark enough that he had to move slowly, one hand on the wall. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly. A window, a back entrance, any kind of angle on the inside that might tell him where his gun had ended up. He was aware this was not a well-formed plan. He'd had better plans in his life. He'd also had worse ones and survived them. What he found in the alley was not a window. It was a woman crouched in the shadow beside a wooden barrel, and she straightened up fast when she heard him coming, and he stopped. They looked at each other in the dark. "You're the one who said let her go," she said. She was young, 20, maybe 22, with a sharp face and the kind of eyes that were always doing two things at once. She was wearing an apron that meant she worked the kitchen or the floor of the saloon, and in her right hand, held against her side like she was hoping he wouldn't notice it, was his revolver. Elias let out a breath that was part relief and part something he couldn't name. "Where'd you find that?" he said. "Under the bar," she said. "Dolan set it there when he came back in. Haskell was going to put it in the back room, but I got there first." She was watching him the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. "I saw what you did, or tried to do." "Didn't do much," Elias said. "You got up," she said. "That's more than anyone else in there managed." She held the revolver out to him, handle first, and he took it and checked it. Loaded, nothing wrong with it, and holstered it and felt slightly more like a person with options. "What's your name?" he said. "May," she said. "May Cutler. I've worked the Callaway 8 months. You know who those men are?" "I know exactly who those men are," May said. "I also know that if Dolan figures out the gun is gone before I get back in there, I'm going to have a serious problem." She glanced back toward the saloon's rear door. "Mrs. Hartwell is still inside. Voss kept her. He's been talking at her for the last 15 minutes about what a reasonable settlement looks like. She hasn't said yes to anything." "Is she all right?" "She's sitting in a chair by the bar, and she's got both hands flat on her knees, and her face looks like something carved," May said. "She's not all right, but she's holding." Elias thought about this. "Go back in," he said. "Don't do anything that gets you noticed. Can you get me to a back window?" May looked at him for a moment. "You're going back in there." "Eventually," he said. "They beat you half to death 20 minutes ago." "I know that," he said. "I was there." Something moved in her expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. She looked at him differently than she had before, and then she nodded once and told him there was a window on the south wall that the cook left cracked on account of the stove heat, and that it looked onto the main room from behind the bar. She told him Ferris usually stood by the front door and Dolan moved around but preferred the right side of the room where the lamp was better. Then she went back inside. Elias stood in the alley and breathed carefully around his ribs. He wasn't going to go back through a window. He wasn't 25. But knowing where Ferris stood and where Dolan moved, that was something. That was geometry. He worked with what he had. Inside the Callaway, Evelyn Hartwell was doing what she'd been doing for the past quarter hour, which was listening to Caleb Voss talk and saying nothing back. This was harder than it looked. Voss had settled into the chair across from her with the specific comfort of a man who was never in a hurry because he controlled the clock. He'd sent Dolan and Ferris to the edges of the room. Not dramatically, just repositioned them the way you moved furniture. And the message was clear. She wasn't leaving until he was done. And he wasn't done. "The offer stands at $4,000, he said, which, I'll be honest with you, Evelyn, I can call you Evelyn, is more than the property is worth by any fair accounting. You're in arrears on your loan. Your occupancy is down. Another month like the last 3, and the bank is going to have to make a decision regardless of what you or I want." She kept her hands flat on her knees. "Pritchard can have the papers ready by Friday," he said. You sign, you take the money, you go somewhere the winters aren't so hard. San Antonio, maybe. You could start something fresh there. Plenty of people have. He sounded genuinely reasonable. That was the part she hated most. He'd practiced this voice until it was real, until he could say terrible things in it without a flicker. There's no shame in knowing when a fight's been lost. The fight hasn't been lost, she said. It was the first thing she'd said in a while, and her voice came out rougher than she wanted. Evelyn, don't call me that, she said. You don't know me. He was quiet for a moment, then, all right, a slight adjustment in temperature. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm trying to help you find a way out of a situation that is going to get worse whether you want it to or not. I'm not your enemy. I'm just a man who needs something you have, and I'm willing to pay a fair price for it. You've been cutting off my business for 8 months, she said. You had the bank call my loan terms. You chased off my boarders. You redirected the irrigation ditch behind my property without filing any papers, which I believe is illegal. She watched his face, which didn't move. That's not a man trying to help me. That's a man trying to own me. Big words for a woman sitting in my saloon at 10 o'clock at night, he said, and the reasonable voice dropped about 2 degrees. I came here to speak to Haskell about an account. You cornered me. I'm talking to you, he said. That's all I'm doing, talking. He folded his hands on the table. I'd like to keep it that way. But Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to understand that my patience has a real limit, and we are getting close to it, and the things that happen when I run out of patience are not things you want to be the reason for. The room was still. Haskell behind the bar had found something to do with his hands that required looking at the bar top. The dozen or so men who'd stayed in the saloon after the earlier incident with the old man were all doing the same performance, drinks held, eyes down, existing in the specific moral vacancy of people who had decided the cost of witness was too high. Evelyn looked at them. She'd known most of these men for years. Cargill, who'd fixed her chimney in the spring. Tate, who'd bought eggs from her garden until she couldn't keep the garden going. Norris, who ran the feed supply and who she'd always liked. Solid, quiet, the kind of man who showed up when it mattered. Not one of them looked at her. I need time to consider, she said. Voss nodded slowly, the way you nod when you've expected the answer and are deciding how much to let it cost. Friday, he said. You come to Pritchard's office by noon Friday. We'll settle it there. He stood, adjusting his coat. You're a capable woman, Mrs. Hartwell. I've always thought so. This doesn't need to be the end of anything. It can be a beginning, if you're smart about it. He walked out with Dolan. Ferris stayed in the room for another minute, watching nothing in particular, and then followed. The saloon exhaled. Evelyn sat in the chair for a moment longer, just until her legs felt like they'd hold her, and then she stood and walked to the bar and asked Haskell for a glass of water, which he gave her without saying anything. She drank it and set the glass down and turned to go. She almost walked into Elias Crowe. He was standing just inside the front door, which she hadn't heard open. He looked worse than he had an hour ago. The left side of his jaw was swollen dark, and he was holding himself at an angle that suggested his ribs were not happy. But he was upright, and he was looking at her with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't heroism, but was something more like plain attention. You should get home, he said. I know where I live, she said. I'll walk you. She studied him. Why? Because Dolan might still be outside, he said, and because I'm going the same direction. She didn't believe the second part of that, but she let him come. The walk from the Callaway to Marsh Road was 8 minutes in good weather. That night, it felt longer. The cold had gotten into everything, and the street was empty in the particular way of places where people have decided the outdoors is someone else's problem after dark. They didn't talk for most of it. Elias's ribs were making the walking a deliberate project, and Evelyn was doing something internal that he didn't try to interrupt. When they reached the corner where she turned, she stopped and looked at him. Who are you? She said. Elias Crowe. I'm staying at the Callaway. That's not what I asked. He thought about how to answer that. I was a lawman for a while, he said, and then some other things. Now I mostly travel. To where? To wherever's next, he said. I don't plan far ahead. She looked at the side of his face. You need ice on that jaw. I know it. I have some, she said, which was not exactly an invitation, but was something. He followed her inside. The boarding house was warm. She kept the kitchen stove going late, she said, because the pipes had a tendency to misbehave in cold weather. The kitchen was a good-sized room with a table that showed years of use and a window with a cracked pane someone had mended with a bit of paper and wax. She moved around the space with the efficiency of someone who cooked there alone, getting ice from the back porch box and wrapping it in cloth and handing it to him without ceremony. He held it to his jaw. She sat down across from him and looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "He's going to win," she said. "Not dramatically, the way you say something you've been holding back because saying it out loud makes it real." "Not necessarily," Elias said. "He's got the bank. He's got the law. Greer does whatever Voss tells him. He's got the contracts and the paper trail and the lawyer. I've got a boarding house with 3 guests and no credit left." She looked up. "What am I missing?" "You've got witnesses," Elias said. "Nobody in that room is going to—" "I know," he said. "Not tonight. But they were there. They saw it. What he did with that gun wasn't business, Mrs. Hartwell. That was something else, something personal that went further than he meant it to." He shifted the ice on his jaw. "Men like Voss, when they start doing things personally, it's because they're closer to the edge than they look." She was quiet for a moment. "You're saying he's afraid of me." "I'm saying he wouldn't have put a gun to your face if you weren't costing him something," Elias said. "And what you're costing him isn't $4,000. It's the schedule. The railroad people have a timeline. He misses the acquisition window on your parcel, and the whole corridor plan falls apart." He watched her process this. "He needs your land in the next few weeks, or he loses the contract. That's why now. That's why tonight." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Spent 3 days in a saloon," he said. "Men talk." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You've been here 3 days, and you know more about my situation than I do." "You've been in the middle of it," he said. "Hard to see the shape of something when you're standing inside it." She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of him without asking. He took it. "The railroad timeline," she said, sitting back down. "If I knew exactly—" "I don't have exact," he said, "but close enough. End of the year is my guess. Maybe sooner. That's 5 weeks. About that." She wrapped both hands around her cup. He watched her thinking. It was visible, the way it moved across her face, which was not a face that hid things well, even when she was trying. She was working through the geometry of her situation in the same way he'd been working through his in the alley earlier, and he recognized the process. Inventory. "What do I have? What can I do with it? The witnesses," she said finally. "The people in that room tonight. Is there any way—" "Not by asking," he said. "Fear doesn't move for a request. It moves for a reason." "What kind of reason?" "One that's bigger than what Voss can threaten them with," he said. "Which is hard, because what he can threaten them with is significant and immediate, and they all know it." He drank his coffee. It was strong, the way he liked it, and it helped with the jaw. "But there's a difference between people who are too scared to act and people who have decided it's not their fight. Most of the people in that room tonight haven't decided anything. They're just waiting." "Waiting for what?" He looked at her. "For someone to show them it's possible." She sat with that. Outside, the wind had come up and was finding the gap in the paper-mended window, making a thin sound. The lamp on the kitchen table was burning low, and she reached up and adjusted the wick without looking at it, the automatic motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "You walked back in there," she said. "Tonight, into the saloon." "Not yet," he said. "I didn't make it past the door before they got to me." "But you went," she said, knowing what they'd do. "I didn't think it through that carefully," he said honestly. "I just went." She looked at him for a long time. Why? And here was the place where Elias could have said something simple, instinct, or old habit, or the right thing to do. He almost said one of those. But there was something in her question that deserved something closer to true. "Years back," he said, "I was working a town in New Mexico. Small place, worse situation than this one, same basic problem. One man had bought enough of the right people and everyone else had decided it was safer to let him." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "There was a woman there too, family of 4 actually, father, wife, 2 kids. They needed someone to walk into a room that was dangerous to walk into, and I found reasons not to, good reasons, reasons that made sense at the time." He stopped. "I left that town 3 days later. The family didn't." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. It was a long time ago, he said. Doesn't get lighter, just gets farther away. She nodded slowly. She understood that, he could tell. Understood it in the specific way of people who carry things. They sat with the quiet for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. He was a stranger, and she'd had an awful evening, and her whole life was being squeezed from every side, and the kitchen was warm and the coffee was strong, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Then she said, "What would you do? If you were me?" "I'd go see Ramon Alvarez in the morning," he said. She looked up. "You know Ramon?" "I don't, but I heard his name in the saloon and I've walked past his shop twice. The sign on his door is straight. The tools through the window look kept. Men like that, who's been here 15 years and kept his shop and his tools in order through everything Voss has done to this town. He's not indifferent. He's waiting, same as the others." He set down his cup. "Start there." "And you," she said. "What are you going to do?" "Tonight," he said, "I'm going to go back to the Callaway and sleep on my bad ribs and try to move my jaw around enough that I can eat something in the morning." He stood carefully. "After that, I'll see." She walked him to the side door, the same door Alvarez had used, he noticed, which meant she had a habit of using the less visible exits, which was a kind of practical intelligence about the situation she was in. She held the door and the cold came in, and he pulled his coat up. "You didn't have to walk me home," she said. "I know it," he said, "or come back out of that alley at all." "I know that too." She looked at him in the doorway light. "Are you going to tell me you're not getting involved?" "No," he said. "I don't think I'm going to tell you that." He walked out into the cold, and she closed the door behind him, and he moved back up toward the Callaway with his hands in his pockets, and his ribs complaining and his mind going over everything he'd seen and heard in the last 3 hours, sorting it, looking for the angles, finding the places where Voss's structure was more fragile than it appeared. It wasn't hopeless. He'd worked in worse conditions. The problem, and he turned this over honestly, without flattering himself, was that he was 61, and his knee was bad, and his ribs were going to be miserable for at least a week, and he had no standing in this town, and no allies except a kitchen girl who'd risked her job to give him back his gun. That was what he had. Those were the materials. He'd built things with less. He got back to the Callaway and went up to his room and lay down on the bed without taking his boots off and stared at the ceiling and listened to the windwork at the building. He thought about the man in New Mexico. He thought about the family. He thought, not this time. His ribs hurt badly enough that sleep took a long time coming. But it came eventually, the way most things did. Not when you wanted it, but when you'd run out of reasons to fight it off. Morning in Red Hollow arrived gray and cold, with a low sky that felt like a ceiling pressing down. Elias woke early out of old habit and lay still for a moment, taking inventory of his body, which gave him mostly bad news. The jaw was stiff and the bruising had spread overnight, and when he sat up, his ribs sent a sharp complaint up through his left side that made him stop halfway and breathe before finishing the motion. He ate breakfast at the Callaway, oatmeal, which he could manage without opening his jaw too wide, and drank 2 cups of coffee and watched the room. May was working the morning shift. She moved past his table without looking at him directly, but when she refilled his coffee, she set down a small folded piece of paper under the cup. He waited until she was gone to open it. It said, "Dolan asked about the gun last night. Haskell covered. Be careful." He folded it back up and put it in his pocket. He sat for another 20 minutes, watching who came in and who talked to who and where people looked when they thought nobody was watching them. A town under the kind of pressure Red Hollow was under had a specific quality to it, a thinness, like paper that had been folded too many times. You could see it in the way people held themselves, slightly turned from each other, conversations abbreviated. There was a tiredness here that wasn't about lack of sleep. He paid for his meal and went out. Alvarez's saddle shop was on a side street 2 blocks from the main road, in a low building with a weathered front and a window that showed a clean and well-organized workspace beyond. Elias went in. Alvarez was at his bench, working a piece of leather with an awl, and he looked up with the specific caution of a man who had learned to assess people quickly. He looked at Elias's jaw without commenting on it. "Help you?" he said. "Probably not," Elias said. "I'm just an old man with a saddle that needs looking at. But while you're looking at it, I'd like to talk." Alvarez set down the awl. About what? About what happened in the Callaway last night, Elias said, and about what's going to happen next if nobody does anything. Alvarez was quiet for a moment. Then, I heard there was trouble. You heard correctly, Elias said, and I think you know that what Voss did last night wasn't business anymore. That's a line he crossed, and I think some other people in this town know it too. Knowing something and being able to do anything about it are different problems, Alvarez said carefully. I know, Elias said. I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm just asking you to think about whether you've been waiting for something to change and what it would take to change it. Alvarez looked at him for a long time. The shop was quiet except for the sound of wind against the front window, and somewhere in the back, a fire snapping in a small stove. You're the man who tried to stand up for her, Alvarez said finally. In the saloon. I tried, Elias said. Didn't go well. You came back out of it anyway. Still working on the rest, Elias said. Something shifted in Alvarez's expression. Not agreement, not yet, but something opening. A door not swung wide, just moved off the latch. Come back this evening, Alvarez said. I might have someone else here who'd want to be part of this conversation. Elias nodded. He didn't push it. Pushing was how you closed the doors that were just beginning to open. He went back out into the gray morning with his ribs aching and his mind working and the revolver at his side. And he walked the length of Marsh Road slowly, looking at the boarding house at the end and at the lot beside it and at the shape of things, the land, the street, the distances, the exits. He was mapping. Old habit. Because whatever was coming next was going to happen in this town, on these streets, with these people. And he'd learned a long time ago that the man who understood the ground was the one who survived when the ground changed under him. He needed to understand this ground. He had, by his best estimate, about 4 weeks before Caleb Voss ran out of patience entirely, maybe less. He walked the street twice more before he went back to the Callaway, and both times he passed the boarding house. He looked at the window and thought about the woman inside who had sat across from him at a kitchen table with coffee and no illusions, and asked him what he was going to do. He still didn't have a complete answer, but it was taking shape. Alvarez's shop that evening smelled of leather and wood smoke and the particular stillness of a space where serious things were about to be said. Elias arrived at 6, when the light outside had gone the color of old iron and the street was mostly empty. He knocked twice and Alvarez let him in without a word and locked the door behind him, which told Elias something about the level of caution the man was operating at. The front of the shop was dark. No lamp in the window, nothing visible from the street. The light came from the back room, where the small stove was going, and 2 other men sat on stools with their hats in their hands. Elias looked at them. One he recognized, Norris, the feed supplier, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a beard that had gone mostly gray and the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time outdoors. He'd been in the saloon 2 nights ago, one of the men Evelyn had looked at and found looking away. He wasn't looking away now. He was looking at Elias with the careful attention of a man who was trying to decide something. The other was a stranger, younger, maybe 35, with a thin face and calloused hands that said carpenter or builder. He introduced himself as Webb, didn't offer a last name. Elias didn't push. Alvarez pulled a stool from the corner and they sat in a rough circle in the back of the shop, 4 men in lamplight with the stove ticking between them. And for a moment nobody said anything because nobody was quite sure who was supposed to start. Elias started. I'm not going to tell you what to do, he said. I'm going to tell you what I see, and then you can make whatever decision makes sense for you. Norris shifted his weight. You're the one who got thrown out of the Callaway. That's me, Elias said. Not a great endorsement. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Norris looked at Alvarez, then back at Elias. So what do you see? I see a man who's 6 weeks from a railroad deadline losing his composure, Elias said. What happened in that saloon the other night? The gun, all of it. That's not the behavior of somebody who's winning easily. That's somebody who's behind schedule and knows it and is starting to make mistakes. He looked at each of them in turn. Voss has spent 4 years building something here, legal on the surface, rotten underneath. But the structure depends on nobody looking at it too hard. The bank manager, the sheriff, Pritchard the lawyer. They're all part of it, and they're all in it because they believed there was no risk in being in it, because nobody was going to push back. Nobody has. Webb said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Nobody has, Elias agreed. Until now, maybe. The stove made a sound. Outside, something, a shutter, a loose board, knocked against the building in the wind. What does pushing back look like? Norris said. Practically. It looks like testimony, Elias said. Written, witnessed, dated. What each of you has seen Voss do. The specific instances of pressure, loans called, contracts threatened, supplies blocked. The details that individually sound like bad luck but together make a pattern that a territorial court would recognize as coordinated fraud. He let that settle. Voss's whole operation depends on nobody telling the same story in the same room. You break that, you break him. Greer will arrest us before we get near a territorial court, Norris said. Greer is a county sheriff, Elias said. He has no authority over a federal land fraud case. And what Voss has been doing, manipulating property acquisition for a railroad contract, that's federal territory. Greer can't touch it. Norris was quiet for a moment. You know a lot about federal jurisdiction for a man who says he used to be a lawman. I know a lot about it because I spent 14 years making cases, Elias said. And I know how they fall apart, which is usually because witnesses talk to each other too late, or not at all, or in the wrong order. He leaned forward slightly, careful of his ribs. What I'm asking you for right now is not a decision. It's a conversation. Tell me what you've seen. Let me figure out if there's something to build on. The three men looked at each other. Then Norris began to talk. He talked for almost an hour. Webb filled in parts. Alvarez added things quietly, precisely, in the way of a man who had been saving information for a long time in case it ever became useful. By the time they were done, Elias had a picture that was both worse and better than he'd expected. Worse, because the scope of what Voss had done was larger than he'd understood, and better because the documentation of it, if they could get it in front of the right person, was damning in ways that went well beyond what he'd hoped. Norris had signed a contract with Voss 3 years ago for grain supply to the Voss cattle operation. The contract had a clause buried in the third page that gave Voss's people the right to audit Norris's other accounts, a clause he hadn't noticed, and Pritchard had deliberately not explained. When Norris had extended credit to Evelyn during the hard months, Voss had used that clause to freeze the account and threaten Norris's entire business. He'd complied. He'd stopped the credit. He'd spent 3 years hating himself for it. Webb had done construction work on 3 of the properties Voss had acquired. He'd seen the documents. He'd seen a deed transfer that had 2 different dates on it in different ink, which was the kind of thing that happened when a document was altered after the fact. He'd mentioned it to the previous owner of the property in question, a man named Garvey, who had disappeared 2 months later. Nobody said he'd been run off. Nobody said anything. Alvarez had something different, something Elias hadn't anticipated. He had a letter. It had come to him by mistake 18 months ago, a piece of Pritchard's correspondence that had ended up in his mail by some error of the postal clerk. He'd read it before realizing it wasn't his, and what he'd read had been specific enough that he'd kept it, tucked inside the binding of a ledger in his back room, because he didn't know what else to do with it and was afraid to give it back. He got it out now. It was 1 page in Pritchard's handwriting, addressed to a railroad company representative named Colfax, outlining the timeline for the Marsh Road acquisition and describing the methods being used to accelerate Mrs. Hartwell's departure from the property in terms that left no room for innocent interpretation. The phrase that stopped Elias was near the bottom of the page. The remaining obstacle is being managed through financial attrition and community isolation, consistent with our approach on the Garvey and Tanner parcels. Consistent with our approach, meaning they'd done it before, meaning Garvey and Tanner, whoever they were, had been processed through the same machine. Elias held the letter carefully by its edge and read it twice. "You've had this for 18 months, he said. "Yes," Alvarez said. "Why didn't you—" "Do what with it?" Alvarez said. He wasn't defensive, just tired. "Take it to Greer?" Greer would have it in Voss's hands before sundown. "The territorial office in Austin. I wrote them a letter once, 2 years ago, about something else. Got back a form response 3 months later." He looked at Elias steadily. "I kept it because throwing it away felt like giving up the last thing I had. That's all." Elias set the letter on his knee. He thought about Evelyn in her kitchen with her accounts that didn't add up, and about the 30 people in the saloon who'd looked at their drinks and about Garvey and Tanner, who weren't here anymore to tell their versions. This changes things, he said quietly. How? Webb said. Because a pattern is harder to dismiss than an incident, Elias said. One corrupt deal is a dispute. 3 deals with the same methodology and a paper trail connecting them to the same lawyer and the same railroad representative. That's a conspiracy. And conspiracy involving a federal railroad contract is something the territorial court cannot ignore, regardless of who the local sheriff is. The room was very quiet. We'd have to put our names on it, Norris said. Yes, Elias said. And before anything gets to any court, Voss would know. Probably, Elias said. That's the risk. Norris looked at his hat, which he'd been turning in his hands the whole conversation. He turned it once more and stopped. My wife and I have 2 kids, he said. A boy and a girl. The girl's 7. I know, Elias said. He didn't mean he had researched it. He meant he understood the weight of it. Norris nodded once, slowly. I'm not saying no, he said. I'm saying I need to think about it. That's fair, Elias said. Think about it. But think fast. He looked at all 3 of them. Friday is when Voss expects Evelyn's answer. If she hasn't signed by Friday, whatever patience he's been running on runs out. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I know it doesn't get quieter. He folded Pritchard's letter carefully and held it out to Alvarez. Alvarez shook his head. You keep it, he said. You're the one who knows what to do with it. Elias put it in his coat pocket. He walked home through the dark with the letter against his chest and the cold working at his collar, and his ribs were still bad, but his mind was running clear for the first time in days, the way it used to run when he had a case with enough pieces to see the shape of it. Evelyn was waiting for him. Not literally. She wasn't standing at the door. But when he knocked at the side entrance, she opened it in under a minute, which meant she'd been awake and near the kitchen, which at 9:30 at night meant she hadn't been sleeping well. She looked at his face and moved back to let him in without a word. He sat at her table and told her everything. He told her about Alvarez and Norris and Webb. He told her about the contract clause and the altered deed and the man named Garvey who'd disappeared. He told her about the letter. He took it out and laid it on the table, and she read it twice, and when she was done, her face had gone through several things that she didn't try to hide. Shock first, then something that was almost grief, and then something hard and still that settled in and stayed. Tanner, she said. Henry Tanner. He had a farm about 4 miles east, packed up his family in the spring of last year. Everyone thought, he'd just had enough and left. Same method, Elias said. Financial attrition and community isolation. Pritchard put it in a letter. Because he never thought it would be read by anyone, she said. Men who are comfortable get careless, Elias said. She looked at the letter for another moment, then looked at him. What do we do with it? I know a man in Austin, he said. Federal Land Office. We worked together years back before I left the service. He's the kind of man who would look at this and understand what he was looking at. He paused. Getting a letter to him is the easy part. Getting him to move fast enough, that's less certain. What about in the meantime, she said. In the meantime, Elias said, you need to not be alone. She looked at him steadily. I'm always alone. I know, he said. That's the problem. She was quiet. The kitchen lamp was burning low again, and she didn't reach to adjust it this time. The shadows were longer than they'd been. Outside the cracked window, the wind was finding all the gaps it always found. He's going to come to Marsh Road, she said. If I don't show up at Pritchard's on Friday, he's going to come here. I know. And if he comes here with Dolan and Ferris, I know, Elias said. That's why we need the others ready before Friday. She looked at the letter on the table. Norris said he needs to think. He'll come around, Elias said. He said it not because he was sure, but because he thought it was true, and the distinction mattered to him. He's not a coward. He's a father. There's a difference. You keep making allowances for people, she said. Not critically, observing. I've made a lot of mistakes from not making them, he said. I've learned. She folded the letter back along its creases and handed it back to him, and he put it away. They sat for a few minutes longer, not talking, which was becoming their version of something, not friendship exactly, not yet, but the functional trust of 2 people who had decided to believe in each other without enough evidence to be certain they should. I'm going to write to my contact in Austin tonight, he said, standing. Get it to the Morning Post. After that, we wait on Norris and see. She walked him to the door and then said, without turning around, "Elias." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The walking home, and the coffee, and the—" She stopped. Started again. "You didn't have to stay." "No," he said. "I didn't." He went out into the cold. The next 2 days were the kind of quiet that had edges on it. Elias wrote his letter to the Federal Land Office that night, at the desk in his room at the Callaway with the lamp pulled close. He was a poor correspondent at the best of times, and the letter came out shorter than he meant it to, but he put in the essential facts. Pritchard's letter, the names Garvey and Tanner, the railroad connection, the timeline. And he folded it around a copy he made of Pritchard's correspondence and sealed it and addressed it to a man named Carlton Rhodes, who owed him 2 favors and had a reputation for not ignoring things he should have ignored. He gave it to the postal clerk at 6 in the morning before most of the town was moving. Then he went back to waiting, which he was not good at but had long experience with. Norris came to Alvarez's shop on Thursday afternoon. He didn't send word first. He just appeared with his hat on and his jaw set and told Alvarez he was in. He said he'd talked it over with his wife the night before. He said she'd looked at him for a long time without saying anything and then said, "If not us, then who?" He told this without editorializing, and Alvarez told Elias. And Elias sat with it for a while before doing anything else. There was something about a woman saying, "If not us, then who," that had the same weight as the letter in his coat pocket. Maybe heavier. By Thursday evening, they had 5 names: Norris, Alvarez, Webb, and 2 others who Webb had quietly spoken to. A woman named Dottie Hale, who ran the laundry and had been present when Voss's men had confronted her about her water rights the previous spring, and an older rancher named Sutter, who had sold his east parcel to Voss 4 years ago under terms he now described as having been explained to him differently than what was written in the contract. 5 names. 5 statements being written, dated, witnessed by each other, building a document that was the kind of thing Pritchard's office had probably never worried about anyone assembling because the individual pieces were too scattered and the people holding them too afraid. Elias kept the originals. He made copies. He split the copies between Alvarez's ledger and a tin box Evelyn kept under a floorboard in her kitchen, because he'd learned a long time ago that evidence only mattered if it survived to be read. Thursday night passed. Friday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of Texas winter morning where the sky was a hard blue and the frost on the ground caught the early light and made it look cleaner than it was. Evelyn did not go to Pritchard's office at noon. She stayed in her boarding house and made breakfast for Calhoun and Mrs. Peel and young Tuck and pretended her hands were steady, which they mostly were. She told Calhoun and Tuck that they might want to have business elsewhere in the afternoon. She told Mrs. Peel the same thing. Mrs. Peel said she was 71 years old and had outlasted 4 difficult men in her life and had no intention of being elsewhere. Evelyn didn't argue with her. Elias was at the boarding house by noon. Alvarez came an hour later. Norris arrived around 2, which was later than they'd said, but he was there. They waited. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Caleb Voss came down Marsh Road with Dolan and Ferris and Pritchard walking behind him with a document case under his arm. And when they got to the boarding house, Voss knocked on the front door in a way that was technically polite and actually wasn't. Evelyn opened it. She didn't open it all the way. She stood in the partial opening and looked at him, and he looked at her. And behind her in the hallway, Elias was visible. Just visible. In the shadow by the kitchen door, leaning against the wall with his arms loose at his sides. Voss registered Elias. His eyes moved to him and stayed for a moment, and what moved across his face was the specific recalibration of a man seeing something he hadn't accounted for. "You missed our appointment," Voss said, to Evelyn. "I wasn't going to make any appointments with your lawyer," she said. "If you wanted to talk to me, you could come here and talk to me directly." "All right," he said. "Then let's talk." He glanced past her at Elias again. "Who is that?" "A friend," she said. "I have papers ready," Pritchard said, from behind Voss's shoulder, in the thin voice of a man who had been doing Voss's legal work for so long he'd forgotten what his own opinions tasted like. "If Mrs. Hartwell would like to review the terms—" "I don't want to review the terms," Evelyn said. "I want to show you something." She held out a piece of paper. Voss didn't take it. He looked at it without touching it, and something in his posture changed, a stillness, like a man in cold water who has just understood how deep it is. "What is that?" he said. "It's a letter," she said, in Pritchard's handwriting, addressed to a railroad representative named Colfax. "It describes, in some detail, the methods being used to acquire my property. It also mentions Henry Tanner and a man named Garvey." She held it steadily. "It mentions them by name and describes the same methods." Pritchard had gone the color of old plaster. Voss hadn't moved. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice was still even, just barely. "It came to the wrong mailbox," she said. 18 months ago." The silence on the porch was the kind that had things moving inside it. Calculations, responses, threats being considered and rejected and reconsidered. Elias watched it from the hallway. He watched Voss's hands, which were very still at his sides, and he watched Dolan, who was standing 2 steps behind and to the right of Voss, and whose eyes had gotten careful in the way of a man waiting for a signal. Elias's hand was near his holster, not on it, near it. "That letter is private correspondence," Voss said. "Getting it to anyone who matters is going to be—" "It's already been sent," Elias said from the hallway. Voss looked at him directly for the first time. "Federal Land Office in Austin," Elias said. "Carlton Roads, specifically. He should have it by now. Along with signed statements from 5 residents of this town describing the specific methods Mr. Voss and Mr. Pritchard used to acquire properties in this county over the past 4 years. He moved a step into the doorway, next to Evelyn, so Voss could see him fully, including the Garvey parcel and the Tanner farm. The porch was very quiet. Pritchard made a sound that wasn't a word. Voss looked at Elias for a long moment, and what was in his face wasn't the cold managerial calm of his usual presentation. It was something hotter and less controlled. He was a man who had been building toward a deadline for 4 years, and had just watched the ground open under it, and the thing he felt was not fear yet. Fear would come later, but a kind of furious disbelief at being interrupted by people who should not have had the power to interrupt him. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've just done." "I think I do," Elias said. "You're nobody," Voss said. "You're an old man passing through a town that isn't yours. You don't have a stake here. You don't have standing. Whatever you've sent to Austin is going to sit in a file for 6 months and nothing—" "Maybe," Elias said, "but your deadline isn't 6 months. Your deadline is end of the year. And Colfax and the Southern Pacific Railroad aren't going to hold a land corridor deal while a federal fraud investigation is pending." He watched that land. "You know that better than I do." Voss's jaw tightened. Behind him, Dolan had shifted. Not dramatically, just weight transferred, the small preparatory movement of a man deciding whether to escalate. Elias looked at Dolan, just looked at him, direct and level, and said nothing. Sometimes the thing that stopped a man wasn't the threat. It was the clear understanding that the person across from him had already worked through what happened next and wasn't afraid of it. Dolan didn't move. Voss stood on the porch for another long moment, and then he said very quietly to Evelyn, "This isn't over." "I know it isn't," she said, "but it's different now." He turned and walked back down Marsh Road with Dolan and Ferris and Pritchard trailing behind him, and they were 4 men walking away from something they hadn't expected to walk away from. And anyone watching from a window could see that, in the way they moved, the stiffness of it, the particular way Pritchard held his document case, which now had documents inside it that were going to be useless. Evelyn closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment and let out a breath that had been compressed in her chest for what felt like 4 years. Behind her, Elias said, "You all right?" "No," she said. Then, "Yes. I don't know." She turned around. Her face was doing several things at once, relief and fear, and something that was shakily close to hope. "He said it's not over." "It's not," Elias agreed. "But here's the thing about a man who's been running on certainty. The moment you take the certainty away, he starts making mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that put him in front of a judge," Elias said. From the kitchen doorway, Mrs. Peel's voice arrived, dry and unimpressed with drama. "Is someone going to put water on for tea, or are we all going to stand in the hall until we freeze?" Evelyn laughed. It came out a little rough and more real for that, and Elias found the corner of his mouth moving in response to it, and Mrs. Peel made a sound of satisfaction and went back to her chair, and the boarding house on Marsh Road settled around them like a living thing returning to its regular breathing. That evening, Voss sat in his office at the ranch house and did not speak for a long time. Ferris stood by the door. Dolan was at the window. Pritchard sat across the desk looking like a man who had suddenly remembered that consequences were real. "The letter," Voss said finally. "I don't know how Alvarez—" "I don't care how," Voss said. "I care what it says and who has it." He was quiet again. "Rhodes at the Federal Land Office. You know who that is." "By reputation," Pritchard said. "He doesn't ignore things," Voss said. "That's his reputation. He doesn't let things sit in files." He turned a pen over in his hands. "We have 2 weeks, maybe 3, before he responds to whatever that old man sent him. After that, the Southern Pacific will hear about it regardless of what we do, and Colfax will start making other arrangements." Dolan turned from the window. "We could deal with the old man." Voss looked at him. "He's already sent the letter." "The witnesses," Dolan said. The room was very quiet. 5 people, Pritchard said carefully. "Signed statements." Voss set the pen down. He was thinking, visibly, behind his eyes. And what he was thinking was the kind of calculation that lived in a different category than the business calculations he was comfortable with. He knew how to squeeze a bank account and manipulate a contract. What Dolan was suggesting was something he'd always kept at a distance, used Dolan's nature to imply without ever having to say. "No," he said, finally, flatly. Dolan looked at him. 5 people with signed statements means 5 people who disappear becomes its own federal case, Voss said. "We'd be burning the town to hide the smoke." He stood. "There has to be another way." But there was something in his voice, thin, at the very bottom of it, that was different from any other time he'd spoken in this room. It was the sound of a man who was working very hard to sound certain and wasn't quite making it. Dolan and Ferris heard it. Pritchard heard it. None of them said anything. Caleb Voss walked to his window and looked out at his land, the dark fields and the fence lines and the cattle shapes in the distance, and tried to find the version of this that still worked, and the versions kept coming up short, and the night outside was very dark, and in a boarding house 8 miles away on Marsh Road, a lamp was burning in a kitchen window. The lamp in Evelyn's kitchen burned until past midnight that night, and she didn't notice the hour until Mrs. Peel came to the doorway in her robe and told her that worrying in the dark cost the same as worrying in the light, and she ought to go to bed. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. What kept her wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the particular alertness that comes when something is shifted and you can feel the new shape of things but can't see it clearly yet. Voss had walked away from her porch without getting what he came for, and that was real. And the letter was real, and the 5 names on the statements were real. But Elias had said it himself, it wasn't over. And Voss had said the same thing, and they both meant it, and the space between those 2 truths was where she had to live until something resolved. She thought about the expression on Pritchard's face when she'd held up the letter. She thought about the way Voss had gone quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was controlled, a tool he used. This one had something rattled inside it. She thought about Elias saying, "The moment you take the certainty away, he starts making mistakes." Eventually she slept. It was not good sleep, but it was sleep, and in the morning she got up and made breakfast, and the boarding house went on being a boarding house, which was the closest thing she had to stability, and she intended to protect it. Elias was at Alvarez's shop before 7. Alvarez was already at his bench, which was his habit, and he looked up when Elias came in and read something in his face and set down his tools. "What?" Alvarez said. "I need to know who Voss talks to in this town," Elias said. "Not his men, not Pritchard. I mean the people he considers neutral, people he might go to when he needs to think something through." Alvarez considered this. There's a man named Oglesby, runs the land assessor's office. He and Voss have known each other since before either of them had much. They're not friends exactly. I don't think Voss has friends. But they talk. Where does Oglesby land on all this? "Careful, man," Alvarez said. "He's done his job fairly, near as I can tell. Voss has never needed to own him because Oglesby just does his work and doesn't get involved in the rest." He paused. "But he sees things. His office processes every land transaction in the county." Elias nodded slowly. "That means he's seen the Garvey transfer, the Tanner deed." He'd have the originals in his files. Would he talk to me? Alvarez thought about it. I don't know. Maybe. He's not afraid of Voss the way some people are. He's just careful. Elias put his hat on. I'll go see him. Elias? Alvarez said it in a way that made him stop. Last night, after you all left, I had a visitor, late. Ferris came to my shop, didn't come in, just stood outside for a few minutes and then left. He said it without drama. I want you to know that. Elias looked at him. Did he do anything? No, just stood there. Alvarez's voice was even. I'm telling you because I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, and I'm not going to pretend I wasn't nervous. He looked at Elias directly. But I'm still here. That's what I'm telling you. Elias held his gaze for a moment. I know, he said. I appreciate it. He went out into the cold morning feeling the weight of what Alvarez had just told him. Not just the fact of Ferris standing outside, but the other part, the part Alvarez had offered without being asked. I'm still here. A man who'd spent 4 years being careful had just told him that carefully, and Elias understood what it had cost to say it. The land assessor's office was a single-room building on the county side of the main street, separated from the courthouse by a narrow gap that whistled wind through it in winter. Oglesby was inside when Elias knocked and entered, a slight man of perhaps 55, with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the permanent expression of someone managing more paper than any one person should. He looked at Elias over his spectacles. He looked at the bruising on Elias's jaw, which had gone yellow at the edges now but was still visible. He didn't comment on either. Help you, he said. My name is Elias Crowe. I've been staying at the Callaway about a week. I know who you are, Oglesby said. Not unfriendly. Neutral, the way Alvarez had described him. Sit down if you want. Elias sat. The office was warm and close, with files stacked on every surface in the ordered chaos of a man who knew exactly where everything was and didn't care what it looked like to anyone else. The smell of old paper and lamp oil was particular and familiar. It reminded him of county courthouses he'd spent time in during his lawman years, which felt like somebody else's life from here. I'm going to be straightforward with you, Elias said. I'd appreciate that, Oglesby said. I've sent documentation to the Federal Land Office in Austin regarding Caleb Voss's acquisition methods in this county over the past 4 years, including the Garvey transfer and the Tanner farm. He watched Oglesby's face, which did not move much but moved a little. I'm not here to ask you to be part of that. I'm here because you've processed those transactions, and if there are irregularities in the documents themselves, alterations, mismatched dates, signatures that don't match, you're the one who would have seen them. Oglesby set down his pen. He looked at Elias for a long time. What is it you want me to do with that? Nothing yet, Elias said. I want to know if you've seen them. Another pause. Oglesby took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth from his desk drawer, which Elias recognized as the move of a man who needed a moment to think while appearing to do something else. The Garvey transfer came through my office in the spring of last year, Oglesby said, replacing his spectacles. There was a discrepancy in the acknowledgement date on the deed. I flagged it in my internal records. He said the next part carefully. I sent a query to Pritchard's office. I received a corrected copy 3 days later. The correction was notarized. But you kept the original query. I keep everything, Oglesby said. He said it with the faint pride of a man whose entire professional identity was the completeness of his records. It's my job. And the corrected notarization, Elias said. Who notarized it? Oglesby looked at him over his spectacles. Pritchard notarized his own correction, he said, which is irregular. How irregular? It's not illegal, technically. A lawyer can notarize his own documents in Texas. But the standard practice when correcting a flagged deed discrepancy is to use an independent notary. He paused. I noted that in my file as well. Elias leaned forward slightly. Mr. Oglesby, if the Federal Land Office sent an investigator here, would your files support what I've sent them? Oglesby was quiet for what felt like a long time. A cart passed outside on the street and the window rattled briefly, and then the room was close and still again. My files reflect what I've recorded, Oglesby said. I don't make conclusions. I don't make accusations. I record what I see and flag what's irregular and maintain the records completely. He looked at Elias. If someone with proper authority asked to review those records, I would provide them. That is my function. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't heroism. It was a careful man telling him something careful, and Elias understood that in this context it was worth more than a speech. Thank you, Elias said. He stood. Mr. Crowe. Oglesby said it without looking up from his desk, already reaching for a file. Whatever's coming, keep it off my doorstep if you can. I have a lot of paper in here. I'll do my best, Elias said. Well, he went back to the Callaway and ate lunch and thought. The structure of what he'd built in the past week was real but fragile. Alvarez's letter. 5 signed statements. Oglesby's flagged files. A contact in Austin who had the package and who, if Elias knew him at all, was already looking at it with the specific attention of a man who lived for exactly this kind of documented pattern. It was enough to make noise. Whether it was enough to move fast enough was the question that kept sitting in the back of his mind and not answering. Voss had somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks before his railroad window closed. Elias had the same amount of time to make the federal response matter before Voss decided the only option left was something that couldn't be undone. The thought that sat beneath all of this, the one he kept turning away from and kept coming back to, was Dolan. He'd been watching Dolan since the first night, cataloging him the way he'd cataloged men like him his whole career. Dolan was not a thinker. He was a tool, effective, reliable, and completely dependent on the hand that directed him. The problem with tools was that when the hand holding them got desperate, the tool got used in ways it wasn't designed for. Voss had said no the previous night when Dolan had suggested dealing with the witnesses directly. But Voss's no had had something thin in it, and Elias knew the difference between a moral refusal and a practical one. A practical no could become a yes when the math changed. He needed to change the math before that happened. He went to find May Cutler. She was in the back of the Callaway at 2 in the afternoon. Taking inventory of the kitchen stores, which was apparently her secondary job when she wasn't working the floor. She looked at him when he appeared in the doorway and did the quick read of his face that he'd come to recognize as her standard response to him, assessing, calculating, deciding what she was willing to give. Dolan's been asking about you, she said, before he could speak. What kind of asking? The quiet kind, she said, which is the kind that worries me more. She set down a can and turned to face him fully. He came in last night after closing and sat at the bar with Haskell for an hour. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard your name twice and Mrs. Hartwell's name once. What about Haskell? Elias said. Where does he stand? May was quiet for a moment, which with her was never meaningless. Haskell is a decent man who's made indecent choices because decent choices were expensive, she said. He saw what happened the other night. He's been different since. She looked at him. He didn't tell Dolan anything. I watched. He said he didn't know anything about what you were doing and that you seemed like just an old man keeping to himself. That's not far wrong, Elias said. It's completely wrong, May said, with a bluntness he'd come to appreciate. What do you need? I need to know if Dolan leaves the Voss property tonight, he said. And I need someone who moves around this town without being noticed. May considered this. That's me then. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I've known that about every choice I've made in this since the first night. She looked at him without sentiment. I gave you back your gun because I thought you were going to do something with it. I'd like that to still be true. Elias looked at her for a moment. She was young and sharp and had no good reason to be involved in any of this except that she'd chosen to be, and the choosing of it was not naive. She understood the risk and had made the calculation and landed on a different side of it than most people in this town. He found he didn't have adequate words for what that was worth. Keep your distance, he said. If Dolan leaves the property, get word to Alvarez. Don't approach Dolan. Don't let him see you watching. I know how to be invisible, she said. I've been doing it in this saloon for 8 months. That evening, Elias went to Evelyn's boarding house and told her what he'd set in motion, and also what he was worried about. He told her about Dolan, and about the thin quality of Voss's refusal the previous night, and about the math changing. He didn't dress it up. She listened without interrupting, which was something he'd come to expect from her. She didn't perform calm, but she had the real version of it, the kind that came from having absorbed hard information before and kept standing. You think he'll come here, she said. I think Dolan might, he said. Not Voss. Voss will want distance from it. She nodded slowly. When? If I had to guess, tonight or tomorrow night, he said. After that, every day that passes is another day the federal response gets closer and the risk calculus changes. So we wait. We prepare, he said. That's different. He stayed. He didn't make a production of it, just told her he'd be in the front room if she didn't mind, and she didn't say she minded, and she made coffee and they sat in the kitchen for a while and talked about other things. He asked her about Martin because he'd been curious about the shape of him from the pieces she'd let fall. She talked about him in the way of someone who had made peace with the loss without losing the loss, with fondness and honesty, not the polished version of grief, but the lived one. Martin had been bad with money and good with his hands, and had laughed at the wrong times and never quite understood why other people didn't find the same things funny he did. He sounds like a real person, Elias said. He was, she said. He was completely a real person. Around 10 o'clock, she went to bed, and Elias settled in the front room with his coat on and the lamp turned low and his revolver on the chair arm, and he sat in the dark and listened to the boarding house breathe around him. Norris arrived at 11, which Elias had not expected. He knocked quietly at the side door, and Elias let him in, and they stood in the dark kitchen, and Norris said, in a low voice that was trying not to shake, and mostly succeeding, "Dolan came to my house tonight." Elias went still. He knocked on the door. My wife answered it. He told her he was looking for a stray dog that had gotten onto our property, and had she seen it, spent 5 minutes standing on our porch describing a dog that doesn't exist. Norris's jaw was tight. My daughter was right inside the door. She could hear him. The kitchen was very quiet. "He didn't do anything," Norris said. "He was polite, friendly even. He left." He looked at Elias. "But he knocked on my door and my daughter could hear him. That's the message." Elias sat with this for a moment. The anger came and went. He let it come and then set it aside because anger was only useful when it was attached to something you could do. "You're not pulling your statement," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Norris looked at him. "If I pull it, what was the point of all of it? What did I do except show him I could be scared?" He shook his head. "I told my wife. She said the same thing she said before." He paused. "I came here because I didn't want to be in my house alone with it, and I didn't know where else to go." "Stay here tonight," Elias said. "There's a spare room. I'll tell Mrs. Hartwell in the morning." Norris looked at the floor for a moment, and some of the rigidity in his posture gave way, not collapsing, just releasing. "I'll pay the standard rate," he said, which was the kind of thing a man said when he needed to maintain some dignity in a hard moment. "We'll sort that out," Elias said. He showed Norris to the spare room and went back to his chair in the front room and sat in the dark and thought about Dolan standing on a porch describing a non-existent dog while a 7-year-old girl stood on the other side of a door. He thought about what Voss had said the previous night. There has to be another way. And how that was true, and also how some men found their way to the wrong answer, even when they'd started with the right intention. He thought about Carlton Rhodes in Austin, who had the letter now, who was either already moving on it or had set it in a queue. He thought about how much time there was and whether it was enough, and the honest answer was, he didn't know. What he knew was that the next move was Voss's, and it was coming soon, and when it came, he needed to be in a position to answer it with something that ended things rather than escalated them. He sat in the dark and worked on what that looked like, until somewhere past 2 in the morning, his body overruled his mind, and he slept in the chair, sob. The morning brought a development he hadn't anticipated. Haskell came to the boarding house at 8 o'clock, which was the first time in Elias's knowledge of him that he'd left the Callaway voluntarily before noon. He was wearing his bar apron still, which meant he'd left in a hurry. Evelyn opened the door, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who was about to do something that cost him and knew it and was going to do it anyway. "I need to talk to whoever's running things," he said. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. Elias came in from the front room and Norris appeared from the hallway, and Haskell looked at all of them and then looked at his hat. "Last night," he said, "after Dolan left, Voss came to the Callaway himself, which he almost never does, not that late. He and Pritchard were in the back room for 2 hours. He stopped, started again. "I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough to know they're not waiting anymore. Pritchard's drafted a response to the Austin office, some kind of counterfiling, and Dolan's been given instructions for tonight." The room was very quiet. What instructions? Elias said. Haskell looked at him. I don't know exactly. I heard the word witnesses, and I heard tonight, and I heard the word enough said in a way that… He stopped again. His hands were tight on his hat brim. I've been keeping my head down in that saloon for 4 years. I saw what he did to Mrs. Hartwell. I saw what he did to you. He looked at Elias directly. I should have spoken up a long time ago. I'm speaking up now. Elias held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Is there anything specific you heard? Names, locations? Alvarez, Haskell said. I heard Alvarez's name. Elias stood up. Stay here, he said to Norris. Then to Haskell. You did the right thing coming here. He went out the side door at a fast walk, which was as fast as his knee was going to let him go this morning, and headed for Alvarez's shop. Alvarez was there, and when Elias told him, he listened without expression and then went to the back of his shop and unlocked a cabinet and took out a rifle that was old but looked maintained and set it on his workbench. I'm not running, Alvarez said. I'm not asking you to run, Elias said. I'm asking you to be somewhere Dolan can't find you before tonight. And let him come here and take whatever he wants from this shop. There's nothing in this shop worth your life, Elias said. There's 15 years in this shop, Alvarez said. He said it quietly, without anger, but in the way of a man stating a fact that was not negotiable. He looked at Elias. I've been careful my whole life. I've been quiet, and I've been careful, and I've kept my head down. And I've watched men like Voss do what they want because nobody made it expensive enough to stop. He put his hand on the rifle. I'm not leaving my shop. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, All right, then we do this here. They sent word to Webb and Norris through channels that moved faster than Elias expected. Small towns, when they decided to communicate, could do it quickly. And by mid-afternoon, the back room of Alvarez's shop had 4 men in it, plus May Cutler, who had appeared at the back entrance around noon and said she wasn't going to be at the Callaway when whatever was happening happened, and nobody argued with her. Evelyn came at 3. She walked in through the front door of the shop in broad daylight, which Elias hadn't expected, and when he started to say something, she cut him off. I'm not hiding in my boarding house, she said. Whatever's going to happen, I'm going to be part of it. That's not a conversation. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. They waited. The afternoon was long. May made coffee on Alvarez's back stove, and they drank it, and mostly didn't talk, because there wasn't much to say, and talking for the sake of it was its own kind of nervousness. Norris sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the middle distance. Webb cleaned his hands on a rag repeatedly, which was a habit from work and also something to do with them. Alvarez sat at his bench and did very small, precise work on a piece of leather and didn't look up. Elias sat near the front window where he could see the street. At 6 o'clock, when the last of the day's light was failing, a rider came down the main street at a pace that was a little too deliberate to be casual and turned toward the side street where the shop was, and Elias recognized Ferris's shape on the horse. He's scouting, Elias said quietly. Dolan will come on foot. Give it 20 minutes. He was right about the 20 minutes. Dolan came around the back of the building, which was the approach Elias had expected. The rear door, the alley, the same angle he himself had used the first night. But when Dolan tried the rear door of Alvarez's shop, it was bolted from inside, and when he moved to the side window, he found it shuttered, and when he came around to the front, because there was nowhere else to go, Elias was standing on the boardwalk outside the front door waiting for him. They looked at each other. Dolan was not a stupid man. He looked at Elias and he looked at the shop behind him, and he made the rapid assessment of someone who had arrived at a situation that had been set up to receive him, and his jaw tightened. You knew I was coming, he said. I had a reasonable guess, Elias said. Dolan's hand moved. Elias was already drawing. It was not the clean exchange of a story told later in a saloon. It was fast and ugly and ended almost before it began, with Dolan's shot going wide to the left as Elias put him down with a shot to the shoulder that spun him and dropped him into the street. He went down hard, and his gun hit the dirt, and Elias crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and kicked the gun clear and stood over him. Dolan was alive. Shoulder wound serious but not fatal. He was making sounds and holding his arm and looking up at Elias with something in his face that was not what Elias had expected. It was not fury or defiance. It was the look of a man whose calculations have just come out wrong, and who is trying to add them up again. The shop door opened behind Elias and people came out, and on the street other doors were opening. A few people, then more. The way crowds assembled when shots were fired in small towns, drawn by necessity and curiosity in roughly equal parts. Elias looked up from Dolan and saw them. He saw Haskell from the Callaway, still in his apron. He saw two of the men who'd been in the saloon the night Voss had put a gun to Evelyn's face. He saw the woman who ran the laundry, standing with her arms crossed. He saw a rancher he didn't know by name, who was looking at Dolan in the dirt with an expression that was complicated and long and had clearly been building up for a while. He saw Sheriff Greer push through the outer edge of the gathering. Greer was a large man who wore the badge the way some men wore borrowed clothes, technically fitted, never quite right. He looked at Dolan and looked at Elias and looked at the shop behind them, where Alvarez and Norris and Webb and Evelyn and May were all visible in the doorway. "What happened here?" Greer said. "He drew first," Elias said. "You can ask anyone standing here." Greer looked around, looked at the faces, looked at Haskell, who held his gaze and nodded once, looked at the rancher whose name Elias didn't know, who did the same. Something passed across Greer's face, not conscience exactly, not that clean. Something more like arithmetic, the rapid counting of which side of something had more weight on it. And for the first time in however long it had been since Caleb Voss had become the dominant force in this county, the count was not coming out in Voss's favor, and Greer could see it. "Get the doctor," Greer said, to no one in particular, which was how he bought himself time without committing to anything. Someone went. Elias crouched next to Dolan and said quietly, "When the doctor's through with you, you're going to tell Sheriff Greer what you came here to do tonight, and you're going to tell him who sent you." Dolan looked at him. His face was gray and tight with pain. "And if I don't?" "Then Caleb Voss leaves you holding everything," Elias said. "And you know him well enough to know that's exactly what he'll do." Dolan looked at the sky for a moment. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The crowd around them had grown to perhaps 20 people now, standing in the cold evening air of the street outside Alvarez's saddle shop, and nobody was looking away. That was the thing Elias noticed most, standing there in the dirt with the smell of gunpowder in the air and his knee aching and his ribs that never quite stopped hurting. Nobody was looking away. Evelyn came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, and the crowd looked at her the way crowds look at something they've needed to see for a long time and are finally seeing, and the expression on some of those faces was not simple. It was the complicated expression of people who had been somewhere they weren't proud of and were considering the possibility of being somewhere else. Greer was still standing at the edge of it, working his jaw, doing his arithmetic. Elias looked at him. "There's a federal investigation coming, Sheriff," he said. Not loudly, just clearly. "The land office in Austin has everything. The only question is whether you're on the right side of it when it arrives." Greer looked at him, looked at the crowd, looked at Dolan in the dirt. He was not a good man, Greer, but he was a man who understood self-preservation, and the arithmetic of this moment was not subtle. "I'll need statements," Greer said finally, "from everyone who saw what happened." It was not justice. It was not even close to justice. But it was Greer choosing a side, which was not something he had done before tonight, and the choosing of it in front of 20 people on a public street meant something that was harder to take back than he probably understood. Elias stood up straight and let the night air do what it was going to do. Behind him, from the doorway of the saddle shop, he heard Alvarez say, to nobody in particular, in a voice that was quiet and tired and absolutely certain, "About time." The doctor came and went, and Dolan went with him to the room above the pharmacy where such things were handled, and the crowd on the street outside Alvarez's shop dispersed slowly, the way crowds do after something has happened. Reluctantly, in twos and threes, people pausing to speak to each other in low voices with the particular energy of those who have witnessed something they'll be describing for years. Greer took statements. He did it mechanically, without apparent investment in any particular outcome, writing in his notebook with the blunt efficiency of a man performing a function he'd decided to perform. He talked to Haskell, to the rancher whose name turned out to be Callum Draper, to Webb and Norris, to May, who gave her account in a flat, precise voice that left no room for interpretation. He talked to Elias last, standing a few feet apart from the others, and what passed between them was not warm, but it was honest. "You understand this puts me in a position," Greer said. I understand that, Elias said. I also understand that the position you've been in up until tonight isn't one you're going to be able to stay in. Greer looked at him. In the lamplight coming through the shop window, his face was older than it looked in daytime, creased and tired, the face of a man who had made a series of small accommodations over a long time and had arrived somewhere he hadn't entirely intended. The federal investigation, Greer said. How serious? Very, Elias said. Carlton Rhodes doesn't open files he doesn't intend to close. And Voss is going to have decisions to make, Elias said. That's above your pay grade and mine. But a county sheriff who can demonstrate he took action when the situation clarified is in a different position than one who didn't. Greer looked at his notebook, closed it. I'll need to go out to the Voss property tonight. That would be appropriate, Elias said. Greer left without further conversation, which was his way, and Elias watched him go and felt something settle. Not relief, not yet, but the specific sensation of a machine that has been running badly, beginning to find a better rhythm. He went back inside. The back room of Alvarez's shop that night held a different quality than it had held 5 days earlier when 4 men had sat on stools trying to decide whether fear or conscience was going to win. The same stove was going, the same lamp. But something in the atmosphere had changed in the way things change when an action has been taken and can't be untaken, a kind of irreversible realness to the air. Evelyn was sitting on a stool with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that Elias had not seen before. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like a woman who had been holding a wall up with her hands for a long time and had just been told she could step back 2 inches. Norris was talking to Webb in a low voice in the corner. May was washing cups at the small basin near the stove, which didn't need washing but gave her something to do with her hands. Alvarez was at his bench again, not working, just sitting with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. Elias sat down near the stove and let the heat work on his knee. What happens now? Evelyn said. Greer goes to the Voss property tonight, Elias said. He's going to tell Voss about Dolan and about the statements and about the federal investigation. What Voss does after that? He paused. There are a few ways it goes. He could run, Norris said from the corner. He could, Elias agreed. Men with money and a head start can make that work, but it closes a lot of doors permanently. He could fight it, Webb said. He can try. Pritchard will try on his behalf. A land fraud case takes time, and Pritchard is good at time. Elias turned his coffee cup in his hands. But the Southern Pacific isn't going to wait for a legal fight to resolve. Colfax will make other arrangements. And once the railroad money is gone, the thing Voss built here doesn't hold together the same way. A lot of what people feared from him was tied to what he was going to have, not just what he already had. Evelyn looked at him. And my property is yours, Elias said. Has been the whole time. That doesn't change regardless of what Voss does next. The letter from Pritchard, the signed statements, Oglesby's files. That's a package that prevents any further legal manipulation of your title. Any court in the territory would throw out a claim built on that kind of documented fraud. She nodded slowly. Something moved across her face that was private, and he didn't try to read it. I want to say something, Norris said. Everyone looked at him. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not performing anything, just a heavy-set man in a gray shop with a tired face and something he'd been carrying and needed to put down. I let this go on for 3 years, he said. I saw what he was doing to her. He looked at Evelyn. I saw it. I knew what the contract clause meant when Dolan explained it to me. I was scared and I had a family, and I told myself those were reasons. They were excuses. He stopped. I'm sorry. I should have said that earlier, and I didn't. The room was quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. I know you were scared, she said. I was scared too. Every day. She paused. You came. That's what I'm going to remember. It wasn't absolution, and it wasn't quite forgiveness. It was something more honest than either, the kind of thing that acknowledged the damage and kept going anyway. Norris nodded once and looked at the floor, and that was that. May set down the cup she'd been washing and said, I've got to get back. Haskell's covering's bar alone, and he's going to run out of patience before midnight. She picked up her coat and looked at Elias on her way to the door. Will you still be here tomorrow? For a while, he said. She considered him for a moment with those calculating eyes. "You're not a man who stays places," she said. "No," he agreed. "That's a shame," she said. Not sentimentally, just accurately. And then she went out into the cold. Greer reached the Voss property at 9:30. He told Elias about it the following morning in the sheriff's office, in the terse summarizing style of a man who wanted to convey facts without conveying how he'd felt about them. Voss had been in his study. Ferris had answered the door, and Greer had pushed past him, which was the first time in 4 years Greer had pushed past anyone in Voss's employ, and the act of it, small, physical, almost nothing, had changed something in the air between them that neither acknowledged directly. Voss had listened to everything Greer said without expression. When Greer finished, Voss had been quiet for what Greer described as a long time, and then asked one question. "Is Rhodes the investigator?" Greer said yes. Voss had nodded once and said, "I'll want to speak with Pritchard first thing in the morning." That was all. He hadn't threatened Greer, hadn't offered him anything, hadn't made a scene, just sat in his study with the fire going and his hands folded on his desk, and that particular stillness that had always been his armor, and said he'd speak with Pritchard. "What do you make of that?" Elias said. Greer looked at his desktop. "I've known Caleb Voss for 11 years, he said. "I've seen him angry. I've seen him disappointed. I've seen him get what he wanted, and I've seen him have to adjust." He was quiet for a moment. "Last night was the first time I've seen him beaten, and knew he knew it." Elias said nothing. "I'm going to need to have a conversation with the county commissioner," Greer said, "about the last 4 years, about what I did and didn't do." He said it looking at his desk, not at Elias. "That's going to be an unpleasant conversation." "Probably," Elias said. "I'm not asking for—" Greer stopped, started again. "I'm not expecting credit for last night. I'm just telling you what I'm going to do." "All right," Elias said. He left the sheriff's office and stood on the boardwalk in the December morning cold and thought about what it meant that a man like Greer had just said what he'd said. Not redemption. That was too large a word and too clean. More like a man standing at the edge of a thing he should have stood at years ago, looking down at it, finally deciding to jump. The air tasted like coming snow. He walked to the boarding house. Yeah. What happened over the following 2 weeks moved in the way these things moved. Not cleanly, not all at once, with setbacks and delays and moments where the whole structure seemed like it might wobble. But it moved. Carlton Rhodes arrived from Austin on a Tuesday, 9 days after Elias had sent his letter. He was a compact man of 50 with a close-trimmed beard and the professional demeanor of someone who had been dealing with land fraud for long enough that it no longer surprised him. He arrived without announcement on the morning stage and went directly to Oglesby's office, which told Elias that he'd read the package and understood where the documentary foundation was. He spent 3 days in Oglesby's files. Then he came to see Elias, which he did at the boarding house because that was where Elias was spending most of his time. Evelyn made coffee and left them at the kitchen table and went to see about other things, which was her diplomatic way of giving him space while remaining in the building. Rhodes put a file on the table. "The Garvey transfer is the clearest case," he said. "The date discrepancy is material, the correction was self-notarized, and I have a witness in the county who saw the original document before it was altered." He meant Webb, though he didn't say the name. "The Tanner farm is less clear on the paperwork, but the testimony pattern is consistent enough to include." He looked at Elias. "Your letter was well organized for a man who said he wasn't a lawyer." "I've watched enough cases to know what they needed," Elias said. "The Pritchard letter is the best piece," Rhodes said. "That letter is what makes this a conspiracy rather than a series of disputes. Pritchard's going to have a very difficult time explaining his way around his own handwriting." "What happens to Voss?" Rhodes was quiet for a moment. "The railroad contract is effectively dead. Colfax has already been in contact with our office. They don't want exposure, and they'll cooperate fully, which is its own kind of poetry given their role in all this." He folded his hands. "The criminal case is going to take time. Pritchard will stall. Voss has the money to fight it for years. But the land fraud charge alone carries significant federal penalties, and the civil liability to the affected parties, Mrs. Hartwell, the Garvey family, if they can be located, the Tanner estate, is substantial." "Will he go to prison?" "That's for a court to decide," Rhodes said. "What I can tell you is that he will spend years and a great deal of money defending himself, and that what he built here is not going to survive the scrutiny." He paused. "The machine required people to stay afraid. Once you document what the machine looks like, the fear stops working the same way. Elias thought about that. There's one more thing, Rhodes said. He took a second document from his file. The county commissioner has initiated a review of Sheriff Greer's conduct during the relevant period. Greer has indicated he'll cooperate fully. He said it without inflection. That's not my area, but I wanted you to know. Elias nodded. He thought about Greer in his office, saying, I'm not expecting credit, and looking at his desk. He thought that a man doing the right thing badly late was still a man doing the right thing, and that had to count for something, though he couldn't have said exactly how much. The week that followed had a different texture than any week Red Hollow had known in a long time. It wasn't celebration. The problems were too large and too old and too unresolved for celebration. But something was moving through the town that had not been moving before, the way water moves through cracked ground after a long drought. Slow, unpredictable, not yet visible on the surface, but changing the composition of things underneath. Norris reopened his account with the bank and extended credit to Evelyn, formally, in writing, without conditions attached. He did it at the bank's main counter in the middle of the day, and he didn't lower his voice when he explained to Dunlap what he was doing and why. Dunlap, who had been making quiet calculations of his own since Rhodes arrived in town, approved the extension without comment. Draper, the rancher, came by the boarding house on Wednesday morning and asked if Evelyn had any rooms available. He didn't need the room for himself. He wanted it for a hand who'd been sleeping rough since the bunkhouse at the Teller property burned in October. She had a room. He paid 3 months in advance, which she didn't ask for, and he offered anyway. The carpenter who'd done the poor work on her roof the previous spring, the one she'd found out later had been told to do it badly, came by on a Thursday afternoon. He was a young man named Petrie, 26, with the look of someone who'd been carrying something uncomfortable for a while and had decided today was the day to set it down. He offered to redo the roof work at no charge. She said she'd pay him half the standard rate, which was her way of making it a transaction rather than a charity, which he understood and accepted. These were small things. They were also not small things. They were the kind of accumulated gestures that rebuilt something, the moral equivalent of putting one board back after another until the floor held weight again. Evelyn watched it happen and felt something she had trouble naming. Not vindication, that wasn't quite it. More like the particular relief of a woman who had been told repeatedly, through 4 years of deliberate pressure, that she was alone, discovering that she had never been quite as alone as the pressure was designed to make her feel. The people had been there all along. They'd been afraid, and some of them had done things they shouldn't have, and none of that was simple. But they were there. She found herself thinking about Martin, about the way he would have said, "All right, let's start with the roof." She thought he would have liked Elias, which was not something she'd thought about any other person in a long time. She thought he would have liked him in the specific way of a man recognizing another man who operated from the same basic principle, that you stayed in the room when the room needed you to stay. Elias's ribs stopped hurting on a Thursday, which he noted with mild gratitude. His knee remained unreliable, which he had ceased to expect would change. He'd been in Red Hollow for 3 weeks, which was 21 days longer than he'd planned, and the feeling he associated with staying in one place too long, a particular restlessness, like a muscle that needed movement, had started to develop at the edges of his days. He was aware of this and didn't rush it. He spent time with Alvarez, who had begun to relax in a way that was slow and visible, not dramatically, but in small indicators, the way a man released from long tension releases it gradually rather than all at once. The file of evidence was gone from his ledger, in Rhodes's hands now, and that absence seemed to create a physical lightness in him. He talked more. He made better coffee, or possibly the coffee was the same, and Elias was simply noticing it now. He spent time with May Cutler, who had gone back to work at the Callaway as if nothing had happened, which was her mode. She was a young woman who did not require acknowledgement for the things she did, which Elias found admirable and slightly worrying in equal measure. He talked to her once about what she planned to do with herself, and she said she was saving money and had the idea of starting a small place of her own. Not a saloon, a cafe, something that served food before noon and didn't require her to work past 10 at night. He told her that sounded like a reasonable plan. She said she knew it did, and that was why she'd chosen it. He spent time with Evelyn. That was the part he didn't examine too carefully, Not because it was troubling, but because examining it felt like it might disturb something that was functioning naturally. They fell into a rhythm over those days that had the quality of long acquaintance, even though it was new. The shorthand of people who have been through something together. The comfort of not having to explain yourself from the beginning every time. She made coffee the way he liked it without being asked about it after the second day. He learned which chair she preferred at the kitchen table and didn't take it. Small things. She asked him once about the woman in New Mexico, the one he hadn't helped. He told her what he'd told her before, and a little more. Her name had been Clara Breckenridge, and she'd had a husband and 2 sons, and what had happened to them was the kind of thing you could read in a report, in a county file somewhere, and it would give you the facts without giving you the weight of them. He had read the report. It had not given him the weight. "Do you think about her often?" Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. "Less than I used to, but yes." "Does this help?" she said. Not meaning Red Hollow generally, meaning specifically. He thought about it honestly before answering, which was his habit with questions that deserved it. "It doesn't undo it," he said. Nothing does that, but it's... Yes, it helps." She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it, which was the right thing to do with an answer like that. On the 14th day after the shooting outside Alvarez's shop, Dolan was formally charged by Greer's office with attempted intimidation of witnesses in a federal case, which Rhodes had maneuvered through the county jurisdiction with the specific expertise of a man who had done this kind of thing before. Dolan, whose shoulder had healed enough that he was ambulatory and whose calculations had shifted considerably since the night he'd lain in the dirt looking at the sky, cooperated. He gave a full accounting of the instructions Voss had given him, not just for that night but for the preceding months, the visits to borders, the conversations with suppliers, the night Ferris had stood outside Alvarez's shop. Pritchard, whose name was in Dolan's accounting more times than was comfortable, consulted with a lawyer of his own for 2 days, and then made the decision that self-preservation was worth more than loyalty, and provided Rhodes with copies of several documents from his own files that he'd calculated would be found anyway and were better produced voluntarily. Voss spent those 2 weeks at the ranch house. He made no public appearances. He sent no messages to anyone in town, made no threats, initiated no contact with Evelyn or Elias or any of the witnesses. Whether this was legal strategy or genuine retreat was not entirely clear. What was clear was that the silence from the Voss property had a different quality than his earlier strategic silences. Those had been controlled, purposeful, the silence of a man who knew something you didn't. This one had the quality of something contracting. Ferris left town on the 12th day. Nobody stopped him. He packed a bag and rode out on the Laredo Road before dawn, and that was the last Red Hollow saw of him. Elias heard about it from May and felt no particular need to pursue it. Ferris was a weapon without a hand to hold him now, and weapons without hands tended to move toward irrelevance. On the 15th day, Caleb Voss came to the boarding house on Marsh Road. He came alone, which was the first surprise. No Pritchard, no Dolan, no Ferris. Just Voss on foot, walking down Marsh Road in the morning with his coat buttoned and his hat straight, looking like any prosperous rancher making a call. Elias was in the front room when Evelyn answered the door. He stood up, but she turned her head slightly and gave him a look that said, "Stay there." Not a request, a decision. And he sat back down because it was her house and her door and her fight in the first place, and he owed her the courtesy of letting her face it on her terms. He could hear the conversation through the open hallway. Voss's voice was different from any register Elias had heard it in before. Not warm. It was not capable of warmth, he didn't think, or had forgotten how, but stripped of the performance. The reasonable voice was gone, and the authoritative voice, and what was left was just the voice of a man in his 50s who had spent most of his adult life accumulating power and was standing on a porch watching it disassemble. "I'm not here to negotiate," Voss said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I could see that from the end of the road." A pause. "I want to say something." "All right." Another pause. Longer. Elias could imagine him on the porch, and it was not a comfortable image. Not because he felt sorry for him, but because there was something deeply strange about a man who had operated through proxies and documents and distance for so long, suddenly having to stand somewhere with his own body and say something with his own voice. "I did what I did," Voss said. "I'm not going to tell you I was justified. I needed the land and you had it, and I did what I thought I needed to do." He stopped. I put a gun to your face in front of 30 people. Another pause. I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks. Evelyn didn't say anything. I don't know what I expected, he said. I suppose I expected you to be like the others. I expected you to reach the point where holding on cost more than letting go. He said it not with bitterness, but with a kind of exhausted puzzlement, as if he was still working out how the calculation had gone wrong. You didn't. No, she said. I didn't. I'm going to lose the railroad contract, he said. I'm going to spend the next several years in courts. I may lose considerably more than that. He was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you this not because you don't already know it, but because I want you to hear it from me that I understand it's a consequence of what I did. Not of bad luck. Not of... He stopped. I'm not a man who apologizes. I don't think an apology covers what this is. But I wanted to stand here and say that I know what I did, and I know why this is happening. Silence. Then Evelyn said, Why did you come here to tell me that? A very long pause. Because you were the one who didn't break, he said. And I thought you deserved to hear it from the man who was trying to break you. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, You should go, Mr. Voss. You have lawyers to talk to. Yes, he said. I do. Elias heard his boots on the porch steps, then on the path, receding. He sat in the front room and looked at the wall and thought about the particular complexity of a man who could do what Voss had done and still have enough left in him to come to a door alone and say what he'd just said. It didn't change what he'd done. It didn't approach making it right. But it was real, in its way. And Elias had lived long enough to know that real things deserved to be acknowledged, even when they weren't sufficient. Evelyn came into the front room. She sat down in her chair, the one near the window, the one he'd learned not to take, and looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Well, she said. Yeah, Elias said. I didn't expect that. Me neither, he said honestly. She looked at the window. Outside, Marsh Road went on being a road. Someone's cart went by. The cold pressed at the glass. Do you think he meant it? Elias thought about it. I think he meant it the way a man can mean something that doesn't cost him anything useful anymore, he said. Which isn't the same as meaning it from a place of genuine change. But it's not nothing. She considered this. That's a complicated answer. It's a complicated question, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. He told her he was leaving on a Sunday. He didn't plan it as a Sunday specifically. It was just the morning he woke up, and his knee felt better than usual, and the restlessness that had been accumulating at the edges of things had reached a point where staying felt like a choice he was making out of something other than necessity. And he had learned, over years of moving, that there was a particular kind of dishonesty in staying past the point where your staying was needed and calling it something else. He told her at breakfast, which they had fallen into the habit of sharing when her boarders were busy or absent. She was at the stove and he was at the table, and he said it without preamble, because with her, preamble was never necessary. I'm going to head out tomorrow morning, he said. My knee's better, and the horse has been standing in that livery for 3 weeks. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood at the stove for a moment with her back to him. All right, she said. The federal case is in Rhodes's hands, he said. He doesn't need me here for it. Oglesby's files are complete. The statements are filed. Greer's cooperating. He was explaining things she already knew, which was something he did when he was uncomfortable, and he recognized it as a flaw. She turned around. Her face was arranged, but not in the way she arranged it when she was concealing something difficult, more in the way she wore it when she'd already done her thinking about a thing and come out the other side. You explained this adequately the first time, she said. I know, he said. She brought the coffee to the table and sat down. Where are you going? South, probably, warmer. He turned his cup. I don't plan far ahead. You said that before. It's still true. She looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was not simple. He'd known that about her from the beginning, that her face was not a simple face, that it held several things at once, and let you see them if you were paying attention. What he saw now was that she was going to let him go without making it harder than it already was, which was a form of generosity he found difficult to look at directly. You changed something here, she said. I want you to know that. Not just the case, not just the legal situation, something in the town. She paused. Something in me. You changed it, he said. I just showed up when showing up mattered. Don't do that, she said. Don't minimize it. He looked at her. You came back through those doors, she said. The second time when you didn't have to. When everyone, including me, thought you should have stayed in the dirt and considered yourself done. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. Don't tell me it's nothing. He didn't say anything for a moment. It wasn't nothing, he said. She nodded once, satisfied with that. They finished their coffee. Mrs. Peel came through on her way to the front room and told Elias she thought he had been a useful man to have around, which from her was high praise. Young Tuck, the carpenter's apprentice, shook his hand in the hallway with more solemnity than the situation technically required, and said he hoped they'd meet again, which was something young men said and sometimes even meant. Calhoun the drummer was leaving that same morning for his next circuit, and they walked together as far as the main street and parted without ceremony, which was the right way. Alvarez came by the livery while Elias was saddling up. He didn't say much. He stood at the gate of the stall and watched Elias work for a while and then said, You know what's strange? What? Elias said. I've been in this town 15 years, Alvarez said, and the last 3 weeks are the first time I felt like I actually lived here, not just occupied a building and kept my head down. He said it with the mildness of a man making an observation rather than a speech. I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I wanted to say it. Elias finished with the cinch and turned around. You were part of this from the beginning, he said. Before me. You kept that letter. You came to the Callaway when you didn't have to. You opened your shop for that meeting. I almost didn't, Alvarez said. But you did, Elias said. That's the one that counts. Alvarez put out his hand and Elias shook it, and that was that. May was at the Callaway when he rode past. She was sweeping the front walk at 7 in the morning, which probably wasn't required, but she was the kind of person who found useful things to do before other people had decided the day had started. She looked up when she heard his horse and watched him pass and raised one hand in a brief acknowledgement. He raised 2 fingers from the brim of his hat. That was their goodbye, and it was the right size for what they were to each other. Something real that didn't need to be larger than it was. He rode the length of Marsh Road last. He didn't plan it exactly. It was just the way the streets ran, and if he went a little out of his way to do it, he didn't account for that to himself. The boarding house looked the same from the outside as it had the first day he'd walked past it. Same walls, same roof, same window. But it wasn't the same, and he wasn't the same for having been in it, and the road that ran in front of it was going to go on existing after he was gone, and the woman inside it was going to go on being exactly who she was, which was the most substantial thing he'd encountered in years of moving. He didn't stop. He'd said what needed saying over coffee. He rode south. The winter of 1892 turned to spring in Red Hollow, Texas. The federal case against Caleb Voss moved slowly and then less slowly. Pritchard's cooperation proved more damaging to Voss's defense than Voss had anticipated, and by March the land fraud charges had been formalized, and the civil suits filed by Evelyn and the Tanner estate and the Garvey family, who were found, eventually, living in Galveston, were consolidated into proceedings that occupied county courts for the better part of 2 years. Voss did not go to prison immediately, but he sold the ranch house in the fall and moved to San Antonio, where he was a smaller man with smaller resources, and the particular gravity he'd held in Red Hollow, that slow accumulating weight that had bent the town toward him for a decade, simply wasn't there anymore. It turned out gravity was mostly about location. Greer's conversation with the county commissioner was as unpleasant as Greer had anticipated. He kept his badge through it, partly because his cooperation with Rhodes's investigation gave him standing he hadn't had before, and partly because Red Hollow needed a functional sheriff while it was rebuilding itself, and there wasn't a ready replacement. He spent the next 2 years being a different kind of sheriff than he'd been for the 4 years before, which people noticed without necessarily forgiving, which was appropriate. Accountability had a long tail. That was how it should work. Evelyn Hartwell kept her boarding house. The railroad, a different spur, negotiated on straightforward terms with the county through legitimate channels, eventually came to the eastern edge of Red Hollow, close enough that the town benefited without being consumed by it. She got the irrigation ditch restored in February after Oglesby's office found the original diversion order in Voss's county filings and invalidated it. Her garden came back that spring, tentatively, the way gardens do after neglect. Not immediately lush, but alive, putting out leaves in the direction of light. She hired Petrie the carpenter to add a seventh room to the boarding house in the spring, which was partly practical and partly a statement that she planned to need it. She wrote a letter to Elias in April, sending it to the post office in a town south of Red Hollow, where he'd mentioned once, in passing, knowing the postmaster. She didn't know if it would reach him. She wrote it anyway. She told him about the garden, about the seventh room, about Norris's daughter, who had come to the boarding house with her mother one afternoon and had sat at the kitchen table and eaten a piece of pie, and asked Evelyn questions about how she'd built the east wall herself, because apparently she'd heard the story and found it interesting. She was 7 years old and had the specific intensity of a child who was going to be someone's problem in the best possible way. She told him about Alvarez, who had taken on an apprentice and was teaching him to work leather with the kind of patient thoroughness that came from having something worth teaching. She told him she hoped his knee was better. She told him she kept the chair near the window and that she'd learned to make coffee without the habit of making too much of it, which had taken longer than she expected. She didn't tell him to come back. That was not what the letter was for. The letter was for what it said, which was that things were growing and she had not forgotten why. He got the letter in June, in a town in South Texas that was not much but had a postmaster who knew him by name. He read it sitting outside the post office on a bench in morning sun that was already warm the way June sun in South Texas was. He read it twice. He sat with it for a while after the second reading, looking at the street, the dust, the slow business of a small town conducting itself, the way the light fell on ordinary things and made them look like more than they were, or maybe exactly what they were. He thought about Red Hollow, about the kitchen table and the lamp that burned low, about 30 people who had looked at their drinks and then, later, had not, about an alley in the dark and a young woman holding a revolver out handle first. He thought about Clara Breckenridge, as he still did. He thought about her with the particular quality he'd arrived at over the years. Not the raw weight of what he'd failed to do, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged the failure without living inside it. A scar rather than an open wound. He had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that carrying something and being destroyed by it were different operations, and that the difference was not in the weight, but in how you held it. He thought about what Evelyn had said on the morning he left, about him coming back through the doors the second time. That's not nothing. Don't tell me it's nothing. He had told her it wasn't nothing. He thought it really wasn't. Here is what Elias Crowe understood, at 61 years old, sitting on a bench in South Texas with a letter from a woman who kept a chair by a window. That the people who changed things were not, in his experience, the ones who arrived already sure of themselves. They were mostly people who showed up when they were tired and uncertain and had more reasons to keep walking than to stop, and who stopped anyway. They were people like Alvarez, who kept a letter for 18 months because throwing it away felt like giving up. People like Norris, who had a 7-year-old daughter and came back anyway. People like May, who handed a gun to a stranger in an alley because she'd decided the stranger was going to do something with it. The courage that mattered was not the clean, cinematic kind that arrived whole and certain. It was the kind that came in pieces, assembled badly, out of whatever was available. It looked like a man with bad ribs getting off a cold street. It looked like a woman who kept her hands flat on her knees in a saloon chair and refused to say yes. It looked like an old saddle maker opening the back room of his shop. It was never what the stories said it looked like. It was always smaller and more uncertain and more real. He folded Evelyn's letter and put it in his coat pocket, which was where the Pritchard letter had been, which felt like something, though he wasn't sure what to call it. He sat in the morning sun for a while longer. Then he went to find his horse. He had heard there were places worth seeing in the hill country north of San Antonio. He'd been meaning to get there for years and hadn't, which was the kind of thing that happened when you had nowhere particular to be and everywhere was roughly equivalent. But some places had a pull to them that was hard to explain in terms of geography. He rode north. He rode north for a long time, and the hill country came up around him in the way that landscape did when you were paying attention. Gradually, and then all at once, and greener than he'd expected in June, with the kind of light that made a man who had been moving for years slow down without quite meaning to. He stopped on the top of a low hill in the late afternoon and looked back the way he'd come and looked forward the way he was going and did not feel, for the first time in a long time, the restlessness he associated with staying. He made camp. He stayed 2 days, then a week, Then long enough that a man from a small settlement nearby asked him if he was planning to winter there, and he said he hadn't decided, which was honest, and also, for the first time in some years, felt like a genuinely open question rather than a practiced one. He wrote a letter back to Red Hollow. He was not a good correspondent. The letter was short. He said he was in the hill country and his knee was improving and he was glad the garden had come back. He said he thought about Red Hollow more than he'd expected. He said he didn't know where he'd be by fall, but that wherever he was, he'd like to know how the 7th room was filling. He sealed it and sent it with the settlement's next mail rider and went back to his camp on the low hill and sat by the fire in the evening dark and listened to the country making its nighttime sounds. Insects, a distant coyote, the fire settling, and thought that there were worse places to be while you figured out what came next. He had been a man in motion for so long that stillness felt like a foreign language, but languages could be relearned. He'd been a lawman and a drifter, and a man who walked away when walking away was the wrong thing, and a man who walked back when walking back was the only thing. He'd been the person in the room and the person not in the room, and he knew, now, the difference in what each one cost. He wasn't sure what he was going to be next. But the hill country was green in June, and somewhere north of Red Hollow, a woman was keeping a chair by a window and teaching herself to make coffee in the right quantity, and the letter in his coat pocket was real, and he was going to keep moving until he understood what that meant. The fire went low. He let it. He'd been cold before and had gotten warm again, and the road north was still there in the morning, and the road south was too, and for the first time in longer than he could account for, both of those facts felt like possibility rather than obligation. That was enough. That was, he thought, sitting in the dark on a low hill in Texas with a bad knee and a healing jaw and a letter from a woman